Cohen is a professor of Russian studies at New York University. And Eugene Robinson is a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the Washington Post and an MSNBC political analyst. Professor, thank you for joining us. Well, let's get to Putin here. What do you think he wants to do? What price is he willing to pay to do it?
We crossed his red line. We've been crossing red lines ever since we began to move NATO toward Russia in the 1990s. Clinton began it, Bush continued it, Obama rhetorically has continued it. The ultimate red line, and unlike perhaps Obama, Putin really believes in red lines, was Ukraine. What Putin saw happening in Ukraine, for him, and we can argue whether it is or isn't, was a direct threat to Russian national security in the form of CRIMEA. And so he reacted.
Why would Stephen Hadley, who was a big shot in the Bush administration, be now pushing for NATO membership for Ukraine, which, as I said in the opening, would mean we would have to fight the Russians personally and directly if they interfered in Ukraine, if that were the case. If we put them in NATO, then we're all the way on the front lines ourselves. Why would this country want to bring our front all the way to the border between Ukraine and Russia? What would be the national interest in doing that?
I have to make a generalization. What we're witnessing in this crisis in Ukraine, and essentially it's moving the old metaphorical Iron Curtain in Berlin right to Russia's borders. That's what's happened. And if it stays there, my kids, my grandkids are going to have to live with it, and it's going to be more dangerous than the last Cold War. What this represents is a collapse of bipartisan American policy toward Russia. And therefore everyone, Hadley and all the rest, who were centrally involved in implementing this policy, are trying to make it go away by doing one of two things. Blame only Putin. Only Putin's responsible. He may be Hitler or even worse. And say, let's fight. And you can't bring Ukraine into NATO unless you change the rules, because no country that doesn't control its own territory can be in NATO.
All right. Let me go back to Gene. You wrote a beautiful column today, and I don't understand these people. Yeah. They're like remember that old character in Arsenic and Old Lace running up and down the stairs thinking he was Teddy Roosevelt on San Juan Hill? That's what these guys remind me of. Well, they're going through some weird kind of flashback.
Yeah, keep in mind, as you're kind of pointing out, they never go fight wars themselves. Well, they just say, well, they want to send other people.
That's the obvious.
This is an unimaginable war, right? There is no such thing as a hot war with Russia.
Yeah.
Because, I mean,
there never was from 47 to 91, by the way.
Exactly. And, you know, that can only happen by accident. Accidents are much more likely to happen when you wage this sort of Cold War right up against the Russian border, which they seem to want to do. It makes absolutely
Why do they want to rouse up the Ukrainians, who are already a passionate people and Russian-hating people in many cases, rouse them up to the point of what they pulled last week of outlawing Russian as the second language, then, of course, getting it vetoed, but rubbing it in their noses. And what does Crystal mean when he says we have to humiliate?
Well,
when did that become in our national interest to humiliate a Russian leader?
That is never in our national interest when there's a crisis like this. Of course,
we did it once. It's Khrushchev. Well, that was great. Yeah, we got
that worked out really well. No, what you want to do is provide an exit ramp. But you know, I'm not sure that the Ukrainians are buying into the Bill Crystal. In fact, they're not. For example, I heard the ambassador to the U.S. from the Ukraine today say that Russia is a strategic partner of Ukraine. They understand the ramifications of ramping this up to a hot level.
Well, let's take a look at this, Professor. Conservatives have taken issue with the president's diplomatic stance, of course, saying it's too weak. They want us to get tough with Putin. But what would that be? What would be the result of a diplomatic policy that revolves around calling Putin names? For example, John Boehner was interviewed by the Cincinnati Enquirer. Quote, is what he said, it's time to stand up to Putin, Boehner said, calling the Russian leader a thug. Well, that helps. Meanwhile, this weekend, Lindsey Graham, I said the seed coolie of our times, talked about creating a Democratic noose. A noose. If I were Southern, I wouldn't use that word around Russia. Let's watch.
He very much cares about democracy on his borders. I would like to create a democratic noose around Putin's Russia. Poland and the Czech Republic, we abandoned our missile defense agreements with them to protect Europe from a rogue missile attack coming out of the Mideast. Russia backed Obama down. If I were President Obama, I would re-engage Poland and the Czech Republic regarding missile defense. I would admit Georgia to NATO. I would have a larger military presence in the Balkans weapons to NATO members who are threatened by Russia. I would fly the NATO flag as strongly as I could around Putin.
So there he's rubbing his face. By the way, it's Franklin Roosevelt who once said, don't mention the word rope in a family where there's been a hanging. Anyway, just Professor, here's the thought here. This morning, the Weekly Standard's Bill Kristol explained that humiliation was the way to go when it comes to the Russian leader. Let's listen to Bill.
We are too quick to proclaim our own helplessness, and I'm not as fatalistic as Jeffrey, I don't think. I mean, if America sort of got its back up and got serious, I think the Europeans would follow. I don't expect them to lead in this respect. We could make life pretty miserable for Putin in an awful lot of ways.
But there has to be a way also to find a face-saving solution or some way for President Putin to actually back out of this almost
I totally disagree. You want him to be humiliated. He needs to be weakened at home.
Steve Cohen, we wanted to be humiliated, no off-ramp, no reason for diplomacy here. We want to rub in his... What is Kristol's problem? What is this neocon brain soup that encourages them to think like this?
You got two things going on at once. You've got Putin bashing and Obama bashing coming from these people.
Oh, that's it.
And they're not exactly clear which one they want to bash more. Give me one personal note. I grew up in the segregated South. I voted twice for Obama as an act of historic justice. But he hasn't conducted himself well on the Russian matter. We need to find a way to stop this, because the next step that's being pushed by people like Kristol and the others is to move NATO forces to the western border of Poland, the Polish-Ukrainian border. If they do that, Russia will cross into eastern Ukraine and pack your bags.
I'm worried about the sequence of events. I'm just watching it from here. I may have missed a couple of these. The professor can add some of them to it. But, you know, the Russian, first of all, the new government, the previous government in Kiev, killed its idea to join the EU. They considered that in Ukraine a double cross. Then, of course, they dumped that guy. And then the Russians did their thing with the ununiformed guys coming into Crimea. What's the next step? Well, that's what the professor makes the point. I worry about the next step. Will it be Russian or Ukrainian?
We all worry about the next step. I mean, you know, Putin said today there's no need for further military action. He backed his troops away from the Ukrainian border. He's got control of Crimea. He's secured his base there, Crimea, he sees as a vital Russian interest. And so I think he kind of lets it lie there and see, and he'll see what sort of accommodation can be reached with this new regime in Ukraine, which he considers illegitimate. But he'll talk.
Okay, play God, Stephen. Play God here. What is the answer here? Well, is it a accommodation by both sides, an accommodation by Moscow that Kiev is an independent country with a practicing democracy, even though it's been uneven in it, and they're going to have some kind of Western ties. We don't want them in NATO, clearly. We don't want them necessarily exclusively in EU. We'd like them to participate with the Eurasian community, economic community we're developing. Is there a middle ground here that both sides, Kiev and Moscow, can live with, so that they can withdraw the troops and live with some kind of, easement which fully recognizes Russia's interests in Crimea?
There's so many questions. I think it's yes, yes, no, no, maybe. But look, here's the problem. Your mentor used to say, all politics is local.
Right.
What's driving this crisis now, whatever you think of Putin, is the insurrectionary, revolutionary, extreme politics in Ukraine. Now, Kerry is there today. Formally, it's said that he's there to find out what they need, but they could say that in an email. We know what they need. They want money and military. He's there to try to chill this government out, because they've been doing provocative things that have been provoking the Russians. If this is going to be our government, this so-called government Kiev, which was not elected, which overthrew the Constitution, which deposed the president, and is a rump parliament, it at least has to behave decently, or America and Europe can't rally around it. And I think that's what Kerry's trying to do. Can he do it? I don't know, because all politics are local.